Hello everyone and welcome to Module 4. This Prezi is going to cover discussions 13 and 14 for week 7. So with this discussion we're finishing out the Smith chapters and we're moving into composition theory and a lot of the different issues that have gone on with composition theory and composition pedagogy. So to start off with, to finish out the rhetoric aspect, what we're dealing with at this point, and this is in postmodernism as well as current times because we're in some sort of a weird postmodern point, rhetoric is assumed to be all epistemological, axiological, and ontological. Rhetoric is assumed to be epistemological, which means it's concerned with, or it's theorizing, or it's discussing the communication and the understanding of knowledge and knowledge making. So how do we make knowledge? How do we understand knowledge? How do we learn knowledge? And then how does that influence how we make sense of audience, culture, ideas, values, and conceptions of reality? What we're really focusing on with these particular ideas is not just how we think about them and how we make knowledge about them, but also how we subconsciously understand and what we're exposed to and what experiences we have that help develop our subconscious understanding of a lot of these particular ideas. When we deal with rhetoric as axiological, we're dealing with the way that communication and our communication understanding and our knowledge making is very ingrained in values, ideals, morals, cultures, ideologies, the teaching and the learning of cultures. So when we look at most children's movies, we're trying to teach them ideas in very specific ways. So my son is obsessed with the newer SpongeBob movie, and there's a very particular song between SpongeBob and Plankton, who's typically the bad guy in most of the television shows, and SpongeBob is trying to teach the concept of teamwork and to make it funny in the song to get kids to really pay attention to the idea that teamwork and getting along with others and working with others is important. Plankton mispronounces team and he calls it TM, and by the end of the movie he also is singing the teamwork song, pronouncing team correctly. So we're teaching these very particular values and ideologies to children through a funny song, but they're making knowledge at the same time that they're learning values, and they're learning to value these ideologies in very specific ways. This happens across the board, not just with children's movies, but it is one particular way that we teach values and morals, and it's an example of one. Finally, rhetoric is ontological, is talking about how we bring ourselves into being. So if we go back to Descartes' I think, therefore I am, we're dealing with how are we conscious, and this is very heavily influenced by the existentialists in decision making. So because we make decisions, we're conscious and aware of our own consciousness, and then we see how embedded we are in everyday life and all of these realities, and how all of these realities shape how we make knowledge, how we understand knowledge, what knowledge we use to make very specific decisions, what kinds of ideologies we've been taught, and how some of those influence our decisions both consciously and subconsciously. So this is basically where rhetoric is at in some very broad conception of how we make sense of communication. So to add into this, what we're going to deal with for the rest of this particular week are strategies and theories and discussions and big fights in composition theory. So the first article that we read for this week is D'Angelo, who talks about a very specific approach to cognitive it's basically cognitive psychology's influence on process writing. So when we're dealing with writing as a process, we're trying to figure out how is it that our brain actually goes through this particular process. And so D'Angelo draws on cognitive psychology, specifically evolutionary development within cognitive psychology, to say if we understand the way that thoughts evolved and the way that people evolved, especially towards groups and to unions, what we can start to understand is basically the function of rhetoric is to guide individuals who are individuals and they're distinct back towards a greater unity, because if we're all separate with our own separate ideas, we could be doing 5 different things. So again, I'm going to use a kids movie because I used one in the last one. So there's a very particular scene in the Lego movie where all of the master builders are trying to build stuff, and they're all fighting over which color pieces they have to use, and they're fighting over the fact that if we look at all of these different contraptions that each of the master builders make, none of them work together. None of the master builders are willing to work together. And so all of their approaches fail, and the only one that actually passes and ends up saving their lives is Emmett, who's the main character. But he also builds the most boring thing that can account for and it can accommodate everybody. He builds a bunk bed couch where everybody has a seat. So he's trying to do the unity. So what D'Angelo is theorizing is if we look at evolutionary development, especially evolutionary development in relation to cognition and to cognitive thought, we see that if we continue to go down a path of individuals, which is important, if we remain individuals for too long and we don't come back together and start working towards a whole, we get a lot of divisiveness. So he's looking at how do we understand that particular theme in process writing to get students to see themselves as individual writers, to take agency over their writing, to develop their own personal ethos and voice, but then to also embed all of that within larger disciplinary understandings and larger disciplinary principles. So if I'm a biologist and I see myself as a biologist, how do I write from within this whole so that I match with everybody, but I can also take all of biology towards a much better place? How do I have both of those things happening? And D'Angelo's using evolutionary development to support his idea. Okay, I put Berlin and Hairston on the same slide because essentially this is the big fight from this particular section. So we've got Berlin, who talks about cognitive rhetoric, expressionist rhetoric, and then he theorizes social epistemic rhetoric. So these are three different approaches to the composition classroom, and he discusses why cognitive rhetoric as a process in composition pedagogy is problematic, and then he talks about why expressionist is problematic and why social epistemic is good. So his theory, from my perspective, is really, really good until he starts talking about implementation. And then he starts pushing for this idea that we need to develop basically little anarchist students. And the problem that I struggle with is exactly what Hairston mentions, where she says that the students become uncomfortable in the classroom because they no longer feel that it's a safe space for them to talk at all about any of their ideas. So we have all of this information from cognitive psychology about how we learn through writing. And if we draw D'Angelo into this particular conversation, we have a lot of ideas for why thought processes are so important to evolution, to moving forward, to our understanding as individuals as well as our understanding as parts of the whole. And Hairston's saying we can't go outside of individuals to parts of the whole with Berlin's approach because we don't feel that it's a safe space to do that. We don't feel comfortable enough talking about any of these ideas so that we can actually have those particular conversations. So what we see here is the underlying question to both of these: if pedagogy is not neutral, which is Berlin's particular quote, what do we do in the composition classroom? So Hairston raises two additional ideas. Freshman composition is essentially a contentless course. We're supposed to teach writing, and we're supposed to teach writing as a process and writing as knowledge making. There is no one essay or one book or one grammar lesson that I can assign to students, or even a series of those things that's going to work well for everybody. So there is no content. So like in this particular course, we're dealing with composition pedagogy. There are set things that we need to read, and there are ideas that we need to discuss. And when we talk about rhetorical theory, there are only so many texts that survived from the ancient Greeks that have heavily influenced how other people have then talked about it. So for the most part, we can assume, when the Dark Age priests from the Catholic Church started rewriting Cicero, we saw the importance of Cicero, not just from our own modern perspective, but from ancient perspectives as well, so we can see the importance. We have a set of content. We don't have the same thing in first-year composition, and so Hairston's call is to return to literature so that we can stay away from the idea that the course is both contentless but tool-focused. Our goal in freshman composition is not to teach grammar. Elements of style, elements of understanding the rhetorical situation of style, sure, that's really important, but again, that's not content, that's thought process. So how do we design an entire course around thought process? We can see how Berlin and Hairston come up with ideas, and we can see how very, very different and problematic both of their ideas and both of their approaches are. So the big question becomes, so what do we do? So what is it that we do when we teach writing? How do we understand teaching writing? We have a lot more theories to talk about this. So for discussion 14, we're going to focus specifically on Freire. A lot of people absolutely love Freire, and I have to say he's never been one of my favorites because, and I think this is the same as Hairston's critique of Berlin, to what extent are you implementing a very specific pedagogy where you're asking students to come to a position where they come together on a social issue and then they decide to be revolutionary? And I find that problematic because what happens to the idea of safe space? So the really important things I want to make sure you pick up from Freire, because we're going to see these words repeatedly as we continue to discuss composition pedagogy-focused articles, the idea of skill and drill, banking method, and the Ford assembly line, or the Ford assembly line model of education. All three of these are fairly intermixed. Essentially what they are is that the instructor knows everything, and the instructor is telling you the information, and then you're supposed to go and memorize it. So if I had implemented this particular discussion board as a skill and drill approach, in the discussion board I would say, what were the approaches that Freire, or what are the different names for the approaches of Freire's pedagogy? And then you would need to respond, skill and drill, banking method, Ford assembly line, model of education. There are times and there are places and there are situations where this particular approach can be positive. So the example I always use is your medical doctor. To an extent, you want your medical doctor, the one who's possibly diagnosing you, to know the symptoms of the common cold versus flu and to be able to recognize the difference. To some extent, that's skill and drill. They have banked the knowledge that they need to know to diagnose a very specific thing. But then you want them to have that critical thinking and that critical awareness so that if you present a symptom slightly differently, they can differentiate and treat accordingly so that you get healthier. So how do we mix, and so I like this as a baseline, but I always want to go a little bit further. How do we mix the critical thinking in there while still recognizing that we need this baseline knowledge? And then how do we mix the two without forcing students into the uncomfortable position of being little revolutionaries? So come on, little anarchists, go out and save the world. That's what all of you guys from 562 should do, right? Save the world. So of course you should. The other big questions that are raised by Freire specifically are the idea of what is knowledge and what is official knowledge. We saw this with Foucault, and they're fairly contemporary. So what do we understand as knowledge? Who gets to make that decision? How do we understand that particular decision? We also saw this when we talked about the New London group when they were talking specifically about literacy. So when we say literacy and we say, oh, well, literacy is reading and writing, we really mean white, middle-class, school-based reading and writing. So you need to have read very specific texts to be able to write in very specific ways because that makes it more official knowledge. So Freire's question is, why does school only need to deal with official knowledge, and how do we get official knowledge and unofficial knowledge, to pull Foucault's term, into the larger public sphere, and how can that help a specific group of people? Then what can we do in that certain situation? There's a lot more in these chapters. Obviously, you guys read them. These are just the things that I wanted to make sure that you paid attention to. Next, we read Salazar, who takes a very specific approach to that liberatory pedagogy and says, okay, if we pay attention to students' background knowledge, their language, their culture, their life experiences, what happens to pedagogy? And so in Salazar's case study, what we saw were ideas of respect, ideas of mutual trust, and ideas of the exemplary role model that helped shape specific classrooms so that the instructor-student interaction became so much stronger that the students felt motivated to understand both official and unofficial knowledges so that they could bank what they needed to, as well as develop the critical thinking skills that are necessary to solve the world problems, to address issues that need to be addressed, to participate in politics, to participate in changes within businesses, to fix problems that need to be fixed. Okay, finally what you read for this week is Gaviscon. What Gaviscon is dealing with, and we see this issue a lot, especially with freshman comp instructors like GTAs and professors who teach freshman comp, students come in and they say, I'm a bad writer. On the first day of class, when I taught freshman comp, that was usually a question that I asked, how many of you guys think that you're bad writers? And then we would talk about, what does it mean to be a bad writer? And the students could never actually come up with examples. They just knew that they were one. And so Gaviscon is really dealing with the idea of what does it mean to be a good student, a bad student, a good writer, and a bad writer? What falls into these categories? And how does that influence my initial identity as a writer when I start to write, if I already feel that I'm a bad writer? And that's a really important position to start to question and start to try to understand. So what we want to do is we want to take students and say, instead of saying, oh, I'm a bad writer, this is going to take forever, I don't want to do this, we want to say, okay, if everybody is a good writer, and we talk about the performance conventions, so we understand, and we've been talking about this with the rhetorical situation, if we understand the rhetorical situation and the performance that's expected, how can we understand how to perform that identity as good writer so that writing is easier, writing comes more naturally, writing isn't such a struggle, and now we feel like a good student. So through these particular approaches of talking about performance conventions, how can we change the approach to writing? Because students feel personally connected to their writing, so how do we make them feel more positive about those personal connections so they have positive identity surrounding the idea of good writer? And then how do we do that from a pedagogical standpoint? So those are the issues that you guys will deal with in discussion board 14. Overall, what I want you to consider for this particular week is, and from this week until the end of the semester, what does this mean for the teaching of composition? And we're going to, in all sorts of different ways, deal with that in the discussion boards so we can understand, and even if you're not a freshman composition instructor and that's not your ultimate goal, what does this mean for the teaching of English? What does this mean for teaching literature? What does this mean for teaching anything at all to anybody ever? How do we understand how all of these things kind of interact and come together? A couple general announcements. Task number 4 for this module requires you to watch a TED Talk and then analyze it. Because TED Talks can be anywhere between 10 and 30 minutes, make sure you guys start planning in advance so that you can watch a few TED Talks before deciding on one. You'll also want to consider audience for TED Talk depending on which particular approach you use to your analysis. TED Talks are delivered in front of a studio audience, and for the most part, that's a hand-picked studio audience based on the person who's actually presenting. A lot of times they're also on college campuses, so we have a very specific atmosphere, and then obviously we're watching them in recirculation. So what does the recirculation mean? How much value do we typically add to TED Talks? What are our expectations of, if we borrow from Gaviscon, the identity performance or the performance convention of a TED Talk, and how does that automatically influence our analysis? So when you start to pick the theories that you want to use to analyze the talks, make sure you really pay attention to how composition pedagogy influences how we look at audience, which influences our understanding and our analysis. Because TED Talks are very, very complex from an audience standpoint. Second announcement, obviously continue to work on your final paper. If you have any questions at all, if you're having trouble finding sources, you can't figure out which theories to kind of match together, to pair together, to put in conversation with each other, to develop your really rich synthesis discussion, send me an email. You can email me or you can always reach out to me on Twitter, whichever one is easier for you. So if you have any questions, send me an email. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the discussion board.